The growing circle of students. By the second week after the incident, George Ellis found himself walking a new path in the very same halls he had swept for years. Students no longer passed him with glazed eyes, absorbed in their phones or their gossip. Now they greeted him with nods, smiles, even quiet respect. It was strange, unsettling, but also strangely warming. He had never sought attention, but he could not deny that the way they looked at him now carried something powerful: recognition. Every afternoon, when his janitorial tasks slowed, he would find himself in the library surrounded by students. What began with 3 had doubled, then tripled. By Thursday of that week, nearly 20 students were crammed around the long wooden table, their notebooks stacked high, pencils sharpened, waiting not for an official tutor but for a man they had once overlooked. George worried that it might draw too much attention, but he could not bring himself to turn them away. He taught with patience and care, explaining concepts like limits and derivatives not as abstract formulas, but as puzzles with meaning, as stories hidden within the numbers. He made the complex simple, not by dumbing it down but by pulling back the curtain so the logic revealed itself. For the first time, students who had long struggled, students who had whispered, "I'm just not a math person," sat up straighter, leaned forward, and began to believe otherwise. The library had become a different kind of classroom, one born not of authority but of trust. George felt it too, a strange exhilaration he had not known since his own days in lecture halls. The numbers made him feel alive again, but more than that, the light returning to the students' faces gave him a sense of purpose he had thought long extinguished. The faculty divide, but the more his circle grew, the louder the whispers in the faculty lounge became. What had started as murmurs of curiosity hardened into lines of division. Some teachers looked at George's sessions as a gift, a rare spark of passion in a school too often weighed down by apathy. Others saw it as a threat to the established order, a trespassing into a profession that required certifications, degrees, and credentials. One afternoon, during the lull between classes, Ms. Harding from the English department spoke up in the lounge, her voice carrying over the hiss of the coffee machine. "Say what you want, but those kids are talking about math in ways I've never heard before. I've had students in my class quoting him. The story the numbers are telling you. That's poetry, whether he knows it or not." A social studies teacher frowned, arms folded. "Inspiration is nice, but inspiration doesn't equal qualification. What happens when a parent complains that their child is being taught by someone without a teaching license? What happens when the district asks us to explain why we let it go on?" A science teacher who had sat in on one of George's sessions shook her head. "Or maybe we should be asking ourselves why a man without a license can connect with them better than most of us can." The room fell silent. The division was not just about George Ellis. It was about pride, about insecurity, about what it meant when a man with no title and no classroom key could do what trained educators struggled to accomplish. Mr. Reed's fractured authority. For Mr. Reed, the transformation was personal. His classroom had once been a place where his word was unchallenged, where his sharp tongue and strict rules kept order. But now he felt eyes on him in ways that unsettled him. When he explained a new concept, students would exchange glances, sometimes even scribble notes with the quiet remark, "Mr. Ellis said it differently." The authority he had wielded so confidently was slipping, eroded not by defiance but by quiet comparison. He noticed students disappearing during lunch, only to reappear with notebooks filled with George's neat handwriting. They came to class more engaged but also more critical, asking questions in ways they hadn't before. At first, Reed tried to ignore it, but each day the shadow of George Ellis in his classroom grew longer. One afternoon, while returning a stack of graded quizzes to his desk, Reed paused at the window overlooking the courtyard. Below he saw George sitting with a cluster of students, the late sun slanting across the pages of their notebooks. They laughed in the middle of math. Reed's grip on the stack of papers tightened until his knuckles whitened. It wasn't that he didn't want them to learn. It was that their enthusiasm made him feel obsolete, and yet beneath the bitterness another feeling stirred, a reluctant respect. Reed could not deny that George had something rare, something that could not be learned from teacher training manuals or state tests. He hated that it unsettled him, but he could not stop thinking about it. George's reluctance, George himself felt caught in the middle. He never meant to challenge anyone, least of all Mr. Reed. He respected teachers, admired their endurance in a profession that often gave more criticism than thanks. But the students kept coming, and he could not bring himself to turn them away. At night, he began pulling out old textbooks, brushing dust from covers that had sat untouched in his closet for years. He scribbled problems on loose sheets of paper, creating examples that mirrored the ones he remembered struggling with as a boy. He wrote carefully, not to show off, but to give the students a way to see math not as a wall but as a doorway. Yet each time he packed his notes away, he felt conflicted. He was a janitor, not a teacher. His paycheck came from mopping floors, not unlocking equations. He feared what might happen if the wrong person decided his sessions were inappropriate. Still, the hunger in the student's eyes weighed against that fear. And for the first time in decades, he felt that his knowledge mattered again, that it was being used for more than balancing his own regrets. Seeds of change. By the end of that second week, the shift was undeniable. Students spoke of George Ellis with a kind of reverence usually reserved for athletes or celebrities. For kids who had once dreaded math, there was now a strange eagerness, a willingness to try. The video continued to ripple outward online, pulling strangers into the orbit of a man who did not even own a smartphone. And George himself, sitting on his back stoop with a cup of black tea each evening, began to feel the pull of something long buried inside him. His grandmother's voice seemed to echo across the years, her insistence that he was meant for more, that numbers were his gift, that knowledge was a light never meant to be hidden. For so long, he had believed that light had burned out, but in the laughter and determination of those students, in the pages of their notebooks, he saw a spark reigniting. He didn't yet know where it would lead, or how deeply it would challenge the structure of the school around him, but he could feel it. The change had already begun, and there was no going back. The library session. The library was almost empty that afternoon, its tall windows letting in golden streaks of late-day light that dust motes floated through like tiny particles suspended in amber. George sat at a long wooden table with 3 students clustered around him, their notebooks open, pencils poised with a kind of energy that teachers often prayed for but rarely saw. He leaned forward, drawing out the function on a sheet of scratch paper with careful precision. "You see," he explained, his voice calm but deliberate, "math isn't just about memorizing formulas. It's about understanding the story the numbers are telling you. When you look at a derivative, you're not just solving an equation. You're uncovering how something changes. And everything in life changes. Rates, motion, growth. That's why it matters." The students listened as though every word mattered. When one of them stumbled through an explanation, George didn't snap or belittle. He asked a question that guided them back to the answer, letting them discover it for themselves. When they got it right, his smile was subtle but real, the kind of smile that made them want to try harder. By the time the clock on the far wall ticked past 4, they were still there, pencils tapping, eyes alight. George realized with a quiet start that he hadn't thought once about the mop bucket waiting for him in the supply closet. He hadn't thought about the weight of bills or the ache in his knees or the years that had slipped through his fingers. He had thought only about the beauty of the numbers, the connection with the students, the spark of learning. When the session ended, the students thanked him awkwardly but sincerely before hurrying out, their voices echoing down the hall. George lingered for a moment in the hush that followed, staring at the chalk-dusted page in front of him. He felt strangely alive, as if he had stepped back into a life he had almost forgotten belonged to him. Echoes in the hallway. The next morning, it wasn't 3 students who waited near his closet, it was 6. By the end of the week, it was nearly a dozen. Word had spread quickly that the janitor wasn't just good with equations, but that he could explain them in ways that made sense. For students who had long struggled under the sharp tongue of Mr. Reed or the abstract explanations of textbooks, George's sessions were a revelation. Teachers noticed, too. Some offered polite praise when they passed him in the hallway, but others exchanged wary glances. In the faculty lounge, whispers grew sharper. "It's great the kids are interested in math," one teacher muttered, stirring sugar into her coffee. "But let's just be careful about who's doing the instructing." Another nodded. "There are qualifications for a reason. If he starts acting like a teacher, where does it end?" The words stung, though they were never said to George directly. But students didn't care about qualifications. They cared about results. For the first time, Kids who had once dreaded math were seeking it out. They scribbled equations on napkins at lunch, argued playfully about solutions in the cafeteria, and traded George's handwritten practice problems as if they were contraband treasures. The halls were buzzing, but not about football or prom or parties. It was about calculus, and George, who had once been invisible, was suddenly at the center of it all. Mr. Reed watches one afternoon, as George explained the intricacies of trigonometric identities to a group of juniors in the back corner of the library. He noticed someone standing a few feet away. Mr. Reed, arms crossed, expression unreadable, was watching. He didn't interrupt, didn't scold the students for gathering outside of class hours, didn't remind George of his place. He simply listened. George felt the weight of his gaze but kept going, patient and steady, guiding the students through each misstep and correction until they finally reached the solution together. When they packed up, faces flushed with the satisfaction of understanding, Mr. Reed remained. "You mind if I sit in sometime?" he asked finally, his tone carefully neutral. George studied him for a long moment, his expression neither hostile nor submissive, simply honest. Then he gestured to an empty chair. "Long as you don't mind solving a few equations yourself." For the first time, Reed's stern features softened into something almost like a smile. Fair enough. George at home that night. George walked home as he always did, but the air felt different. The streetlights buzzed faintly above him, and the quiet of the neighborhood wrapped around him like an old coat. He carried his lunch pail and his mop-stiffened gloves, but his mind was elsewhere. At his duplex, he cooked his usual modest dinner and brewed his black tea. But when he sat on the back stoop, staring into the dusk, his thoughts didn't drift aimlessly the way they usually did. Instead, he replayed the eager questions of the students, the spark in their eyes, the way they leaned forward as though every explanation mattered. He thought about how his grandmother used to sit beside him with flashcards, believing fiercely in his potential even when the world didn't. He thought about the way his dreams had been deferred, about the bridges he had never built, the machines he had never designed. For years, he had convinced himself that peace came from simplicity, from accepting the life he had. But now, for the first time in decades, he wondered if simplicity wasn't enough. He wondered if there was still time for something more. As the radio hummed faintly in the kitchen behind him, George leaned back against the railing, the night air cool against his face. He had no idea that his story was only just beginning, that the ripples from that single derivative problem would stretch further than he could imagine. To him, it was still just numbers on a page, a few students who cared enough to ask questions. But to Chesterfield High, and soon to the wider world watching through their glowing phone screens, it was the start of something much bigger. By the third week after the incident, Chesterfield High had become a different school entirely. Rumors about George Ellis spread through the corridors, as if he were not just a man but a legend in the making. Stories morphed and exaggerated in the way that teenage retellings always do. Some claimed he had once built a working car engine from scratch when he was only 15. Others swore he had turned down a six-figure job at NASA to find peace sweeping floors. The truth that he had once been a promising engineering student before life rerouted him was known only to a few, but the myth that surrounded him was larger than truth. For the students, though, the stories mattered less than the reality they encountered each afternoon in the library. They didn't need to know if he had built bridges or designed engines. They knew he could take the math that tied their brains in knots and untangle it with patience and clarity. They knew he saw them, not as empty heads to be filled, but as minds capable of real discovery. That alone was enough to draw them in day after day. The reverent students began to show unnerved some of the faculty. Teachers who had spent years fighting for attention in classrooms watched with equal parts awe and resentment as George, the janitor, commanded it without trying. His authority wasn't granted by title or enforced by grades. It was born of humility, authenticity, and the quiet dignity of a man who cared more about the learning than about the credit. The faculty meeting, Principal Evans eventually decided the situation required addressing. At the end of that week, he called an emergency faculty meeting in the auditorium, the kind where the folding chairs creaked under the weight of tired bodies and the hum of fluorescent lights pressed down like static. "Let's not dance around the issue," Evans began, his voice steady. "By now you've all seen the video and you've all heard what's been happening after hours in the library." Murmurs rippled across the room. Some leaned forward, curious, while others folded their arms in visible disapproval. Mr. Ellis has been tutoring students in mathematics, Evans continued. Unofficially, yes. Unscheduled, yes. But undeniably with impact. Test scores are beginning to tick upward in some classes. Attendance at study sessions has grown. And most importantly, students are talking about learning with excitement. I cannot ignore that. A history teacher raised her hand sharply. With respect, Mark, you also can't ignore that he is not licensed to teach. What happens when a parent demands answers? Or worse, when the district finds out? We could be risking lawsuits. Another voice chimed in, more supportive. Or maybe we should be asking ourselves why students are finding more clarity from him than from our own lessons. Isn't our job to foster learning however it comes? The room split down the middle, half nodding in agreement, half tightening their lips in frustration. At the back of the room, Mr. Reed sat stiffly, his gaze locked on the stage, his jaw working silently. To him, it was not just about qualifications or liability. It was about pride, about the shifting balance of respect in a school where he had once been the unquestioned authority in mathematics. Principal Evans, sensing the divide, lifted his hands for calm. No decisions will be made tonight. But understand this, we are at a crossroads. George Ellis is no longer invisible. The students have chosen to see him. Whether we like it or not, that changes things. The students pushed back. That weekend, word of the faculty meeting trickled down to the students. By Monday morning, whispers filled the halls. They're trying to stop him. They don't want Mr. Ellis teaching us anymore. What might have been a quiet administrative discussion turned into fuel for student loyalty. At lunch, a group of seniors began talking openly about organizing. If they shut him down, we protest, Sierra Martinez declared, her voice carrying over the din of the cafeteria. We've finally got someone who makes math feel like more than torture, and they want to take that away? Not happening. Others nodded fiercely, energized by the thought of standing up for the janitor who had shown them respect. Wes Granger, normally soft-spoken, added quietly but firmly, "They think he doesn't belong in a classroom. But maybe he's the only one who actually does." The sentiment spread like wildfire. What had begun as awe was now solidifying into loyalty. George was no longer just a curiosity or a viral sensation. To the students of Chesterfield High, he had become theirs. George's quiet doubt. George, meanwhile, felt the shift without fully understanding its magnitude. He noticed the way students looked at him now. Not just with curiosity, but with a kind of protective pride. He overheard their whispers about protests and petitions, and it unsettled him. He had never wanted to be at the center of conflict. His life had been built on avoiding attention, on moving quietly through the world. Now every step seemed amplified. Every word carried weight he had not asked for. At night, sitting on his stoop with his cup of tea, he wrestled with questions that gnawed at him. Was he doing the right thing by helping them? Was he overstepping? Was he setting them up for disappointment when the administration finally put an end to it? And yet when he closed his eyes, he saw their eager faces, heard their questions, felt the spark of their excitement. That was what kept him going back to the library, even when his conscience warned him of the storm gathering. Reed's decision for Mr. Reed, the storm was already personal. He stayed late one evening, his classroom empty, the whiteboard filled with half-erased formulas. His hand hovered over a marker, but he couldn't bring himself to write. His authority had always come from being the smartest man in the room, the one with answers ready before anyone else could even form the question. But George Ellis had shattered that illusion in a matter of minutes, and Reed could not decide whether to hate him or respect him. Finally, he made a choice. The next afternoon, as George wrapped up another impromptu library session, Reed appeared in the doorway. His presence silenced the room, students looking back and forth between the two men with wide eyes. "Mr. Ellis," Reed said, his voice steady but tinged with something new, something less like sarcasm and more like challenge. "Mind if I sit in next time?" George studied him, weighing the request. He saw not just pride, but a flicker of something else. Perhaps humility, perhaps a desperate attempt to reclaim ground. At last, George nodded slowly. "Long as you're ready to solve a few problems yourself." For the first time in weeks, Reed allowed himself a thin smile. "Fair enough." Ripples in the hallways. A different kind of morning. The Monday after the incident carried an energy Chesterfield High had not felt in years. Normally, the week began with dragging feet and groggy complaints, but now there was an eager brightness that shimmered in the hallways. Students moved with unusual urgency, holding their phones out like lanterns, showing the video to anyone who hadn't seen it yet. The clip had left the walls of the school far behind. By now it had crossed state lines, carried by reposts, hashtags, and duets. Sierra Martinez's edit had exploded past her usual following, catching the attention of strangers who marveled at the soft-spoken janitor with the mind of a mathematician. The school felt divided into two kinds of people, those who had seen the video and those who hadn't, but within hours the second group dwindled to none. Conversations between classes were no longer about weekend football scores or gossip from the homecoming dance. They were about George Ellis, did you hear? He went to Georgia Tech. No way. My cousin says he's on her For You page right now. Imagine mopping floors when you could be, like, designing spaceships or something. George himself entered through the back entrance as always, long before the first bell. He clocked in quietly, his ring of keys jingling faintly at his hip, and began his routine. Yet the air felt different. Students who once drifted past him without so much as a glance now nodded in his direction. Some even whispered good morning, shy but deliberate, as if acknowledging someone they had suddenly learned was far more than what they saw. George accepted each greeting with a small nod, but kept his eyes forward. It wasn't pride that kept him silent, it was bewilderment. For a man who had spent years blending into the background, being noticed felt less like flattery and more like a spotlight he hadn't asked for. The principal's invitation that afternoon, George found himself once again called into Principal Evans' office. The man looked tired but animated, his phone face up on the desk with the viral clip paused at the moment George capped the marker after finishing the derivative. "George," Evans began, "you've become something of a local celebrity." George gave a dry, almost reluctant smile. Not exactly the title I was aiming for. "It's not just here," Evans pressed, leaning forward. "Parents are calling. The school board has already asked me about you. I even had a reporter leave a message this morning." George shifted, uncomfortable. "It was just a math problem." Evans shook his head firmly. "No, George. It wasn't just a math problem. You should have seen the way those kids looked at you. I've been in education 30 years. I know when students are pretending to care and when they're actually inspired. What you gave them was more than an answer. You gave them a glimpse of possibility." George's brow furrowed, his voice quieter. "Possibility doesn't pay the rent." Evans exhaled slowly. "No, but it can change lives. Including yours, maybe." He hesitated, then asked again, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone about Georgia Tech?" George paused. It wasn't shame that held him back, but the exhaustion of reliving the choices that had redirected his life. Still, he answered, speaking in long, measured sentences like a man recounting a story, carved into him with time. "I was raised by my grandmother in a town where opportunity didn't come knocking. She worked herself raw just to keep food on the table. I was the first to leave for college. Engineering was my dream. But then my brother got caught up in a case he never should have been dragged into. My grandmother's health started to fail. The bills, they didn't care that I was supposed to be building bridges and engines. Someone had to be there. Someone had to pay. I left school, told myself it would only be for a while. But a while turned into years. Jobs turned into routines. And one day I realized I'd rerouted so far from where I started I couldn't even see the original road." The room fell silent. Evans absorbed the story, not with pity, but with the gravity of someone finally seeing a truth hidden in plain sight. At last he said, "Maybe it's time you reroute again." George didn't answer, only lowered his eyes and folded his calloused hands together. A man caught between the weight of the past and the fragile possibility of the future. Students at his door by midweek. George couldn't ignore the new rhythm taking shape. When he returned to his supply closet after lunch, he found 3 students waiting again, notebooks in hand. By Thursday there were 7. By Friday, nearly a dozen, crowding the narrow hallway with an eagerness that defied the usual after-lunch slump. "Mr. Ellis," one of them said, "could you show us how you did that derivative again? And maybe explain trig identities?" Another added. George blinked, unsure. "Don't you have teachers for this?" "Yes, Jaden," the quiet sophomore said plainly. "But you make it make sense?" The honesty disarmed him. He hesitated, glancing at his gloves and mop handle, then finally set them aside. "All right then. Library, 10 minutes." That afternoon he found himself at a long table surrounded by a semicircle of students, their notebooks open, pencils poised. He spoke, Not like a lecturer, but like a guide, breaking problems down piece by piece, asking questions that led them toward discovery rather than barking out answers. He didn't just tell them what to do. He explained why it worked. And when they got something wrong, he didn't sigh in frustration. He redirected gently, patiently, as if mistakes were not failures but stepping stones. For students who had long felt invisible or incapable, it was revolutionary. Teachers, take notice. Not everyone was thrilled. By the end of the week, whispers in the faculty lounge had sharpened into quiet complaints. "It's all well and good that the kids are interested in math," one teacher muttered. "But let's remember he's a janitor, not an educator." "Exactly," another said.
"There are certifications, licenses."
"If the board finds out we've got a custodian teaching calculus, it could turn into a liability." A third voice, softer but pointed, added, "Or it could turn into something this school desperately needs." The room fell into uneasy silence. The truth was undeniable. The students were talking about math with an enthusiasm no one had seen in years. For some teachers, that was a miracle. For others, it was a threat. And at the center of it all was George Ellis, the man with the mop and the equations, the man who had never sought the spotlight but now found it shining directly on him. A spark rekindled at home that Friday night. George pulled an old cardboard box from beneath his bed. Inside were relics of a different life, worn textbooks, dog-eared notebooks filled with calculations, diagrams sketched on loose sheets of paper, even a faded acceptance letter from Georgia Tech. He sat cross-legged on the floor, thumbing through the pages, his fingers tracing the equations as though reconnecting with an old friend. He found himself writing again, scribbling new practice problems in the margins of a yellowed notebook. His handwriting was slower than it once was, but the rhythm came back easily, the numbers flowing with a familiarity that made his chest ache. For years, he had convinced himself that peace came from invisibility, from routine, from never asking for more. But as he sat in the glow of a desk lamp, equations spilling across the page, George felt something stir inside him, an ember of the man he used to be. And though he didn't yet know where it would lead, he knew one thing for certain: the spark was back. The buzz after class, by the time the bell rang and the students spilled out of room 218, the atmosphere in the hallway had changed. Normally, the corridors between classes were filled with the usual chaos: slamming lockers, chatter about weekend plans, sneaker soles squeaking against polished tile. But today there was an electric undercurrent. It wasn't about the upcoming football game or who was dating whom. It was about what they had just witnessed. Wesley Wes Granger, a senior with a quiet, analytical demeanor, had been sitting near the back of the classroom during the incident. He was not the type to laugh at cheap jokes or participate in the endless chatter about TikTok trends. He noticed things other people overlooked. As the class emptied, he lingered at his locker, watching clusters of students gathering in circles, whispering furiously. He caught fragments of their conversations. Did you see how fast he did it? He didn't even break a sweat. Reed looked like he swallowed his own tongue. It wasn't just that George Ellis had solved the problem. It was the way he had done it, clear, methodical, without arrogance or hesitation. In that single moment, he had flipped the script. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was something else. One student, Sierra Martinez, already had her phone out. She was quick with edits, quick with timing, always looking for the perfect viral moment. She had recorded the entire exchange on her iPad, and now, as she leaned against the lockers, her fingers flew across the screen. Within minutes, she had trimmed the clip, added a caption, "When your janitor knows more calculus than your teacher," and posted it. She smirked to herself, already anticipating the likes rolling in before dinner. But for George Ellis, none of that mattered. He didn't even own a smartphone. By the time Sierra's post began its slow climb to viral status, George was already halfway through mopping the science wing, humming quietly under his breath. The walk home that evening, George followed the same routine he had perfected over years. He refilled the soap dispensers in the locker rooms, swept the stairwells, and carefully lined up the rows of trash bins along the back hallway. He took quiet satisfaction in order, in the sense that he had left the building just a little better than he found it. When his shift ended, he clocked out, tucked his key ring into his belt loop, and walked through the fading light of Chesterfield's east side. The neighborhood wasn't wealthy. Mailboxes leaned slightly from years of weathering. and chain-link fences sagged in spots where children had climbed them one too many times. Streetlights flickered reluctantly to life, buzzing faintly. George walked with an easy stride, his shoulders relaxed, his lunch pail swinging lightly in one hand. He cut through the back lot of the public library, where the building loomed quiet and dark, and turned toward his small duplex tucked just behind it. His home was modest but steady. A narrow living room lined with shelves of old books and radios he had repaired over the years, a kitchen stocked with simple staples, a small back stoop where he liked to sit with a cup of tea. That night he grilled a chicken breast, heated some canned green beans, and toasted a single slice of wheat bread. He ate quietly, the only sound the low murmur of his transistor radio, which played an old jazz station with static humming at the edges. Afterward, he made his tea, always black, never sweetened, and stepped outside. The dusk sky was painted with streaks of orange and violet. The world felt calm. George leaned against the railing of his stoop and took a long sip, savoring the warmth. He did not think about the classroom or the looks on the students' faces. He did not know about Sierra's video. To him, it had been just another day, another floor to mop, another task finished. He never once imagined that his name had already started bouncing around the digital halls of TikTok, gathering momentum with every refresh, whispers in the faculty lounge. While George sat in his quiet duplex, Chesterfield High was alive in a way it rarely was after hours. In the faculty lounge, a place usually reserved for half-hearted coffee and whispered complaints about grading, the teachers were buzzing. A group of them huddled around a smartphone watching Sierra's video replayed on a loop. "Is this for real?" asked Ms. Harding from the English department, squinting at the screen. "He just solves it like it's nothing." "I always thought he was just quiet," another teacher murmured. "Didn't know he was some kind of math genius." Mr. Reed had not joined them. He had disappeared quickly after the final bell, his jaw tight, his usual self-confidence dulled. But the whispers grew bolder in his absence. You'd think someone with that kind of brain wouldn't be pushing a mop around. I wonder what his story is. Maybe he should be teaching instead of some people. The laughter that followed was nervous, half guilty, but beneath it ran a thread of something else, curiosity, maybe even admiration. The video had cracked open a door no one had bothered to knock on before. For the first time, people were asking who George Ellis really was. Principal Evans sees the video across town, in a quiet two-story house with a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Principal Evans sat at his desk scrolling through emails when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his niece, a sophomore at the high school. "Uncle Mark, you've got to see this. Our janitor just cooked Mr. Reed in class today. It's blowing up on TikTok." Curious, Evans clicked the link. He watched the video once, then again and again. George's calm voice, the swift movements of his hand across the board, the absolute silence in the room. Evans leaned back in his chair, frowning. 7 years George Ellis had worked under his roof, always punctual, always polite, never drawing attention to himself. Evans had thought of him as reliable, dependable, someone who kept the gears turning quietly in the background. He had never once wondered what had brought George there, what history he carried behind those steady eyes. Now the whole internet was wondering. Evans closed the video and rubbed his temples. 7 years, he muttered, and I never thought to ask. Morning whispers. The next morning, Chesterfield High didn't sound the same. Usually, the start of the school day carried a sluggish rhythm. Yawns hidden behind hoodie sleeves, the thud of sneakers dragging across waxed floors, teachers clutching coffee like lifelines. But today there was a sharper undercurrent, a hum of excitement that ran from one end of the building to the other. Phones were out before the first bell, screens held up in crowded knots of students huddled near lockers. They whispered, laughed, gasped, and replayed the same 30-second clip again and again. The janitor had become the headline. George Ellis didn't notice. Or rather, he noticed the unusual smiles and nods directed his way, but he didn't know what to make of them. A freshman he had never spoken to before greeted him with a timid, "Morning, Mr. Ellis." 2 seniors offered a small wave as he pushed his mop bucket down the hall. Even the security guard at the front entrance raised his chin in a quiet acknowledgement. George gave each a polite nod, but he kept moving. He wasn't used to being acknowledged, and he didn't know how to process the sudden change. In truth, he carried on as he always did. He unlocked his supply closet near the east stairwell, tied the drawstrings of his work gloves, and began his routine. checking light bulbs, scrubbing the stubborn graffiti carved into the bathroom stalls, tightening the bolts on a locker that had been banging open all week. To him it was just another day, but to the students who passed him in the hall, it felt like they were walking past someone different, someone they had overlooked for too long. A summons from the principal by mid-morning. Just as George was finishing up a leaky faucet repair in the science wing, he was paged to the principal's office. The announcement crackled over the intercom, startling him for the briefest moment. He wiped his hands with a rag, straightened his uniform shirt, and made his way down the hall. Principal Evans sat behind his wide oak desk, hands folded neatly, his expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. He motioned for George to sit, but George remained standing, dust from a locker hinge still clinging faintly to his forearm. "Mr. Ellis," Evans began, his voice slow and deliberate. "I've seen the video. So has half the school board by now. Let's just say it's making the rounds." George shifted slightly on his feet, not quite sure how to respond. He had heard whispers about the recording, seen students smirking with phones in hand, but he hadn't given it much thought. "Is it true," Evans pressed, "that you studied engineering?" For a moment, George looked down as if searching for a memory he hadn't dusted off in years. When he finally spoke, his words were simple, unembellished. "I went to Georgia Tech, mechanical engineering. Full scholarship." Evans blinked, taken aback. That explained the clarity, the precision, the calm with which George had dismantled the derivative problem. But it didn't explain everything. Why someone with that kind of background had ended up sweeping floors at a public high school was a question that hung heavy in the room. So Evans asked. And slowly, George told him George's story. He spoke of Mon, Georgia, the small town where he had been raised by his grandmother after his parents disappeared from the picture. She had worked 2 cleaning jobs, often arriving home with her hands cracked from bleach and scrubbing, yet she always found time to sit beside him at night with flashcards, Bible verses, and stories about perseverance. George described how numbers had always made sense to him in a world that often felt unpredictable. He took apart lawnmowers and radios, hungry to understand how things worked, piecing them back together with the precision of a boy who saw equations in everything. When he earned a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, he became the first in his family to go to college. He had planned to design bridges, engines, solutions to problems people didn't even know they had yet. But dreams, he explained, were delicate things. During his sophomore year, his younger brother was arrested in a case that should have never gone to trial. A story of misidentification and a system too eager to find someone to blame. At the same time, his grandmother's health began to fail. Hospital bills mounted, and the financial aid that once felt like a golden ticket began to stretch thin. George left school, telling himself it was temporary. He took jobs, one then another, until a year turned into 5. The pause became permanent, and one day he realized he had rerouted his life entirely. Evans listened quietly, not as a man passing judgment, but as someone who was finally seeing the full picture. When George finished, Evans leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about going back?" he asked softly. George shrugged. "I used to, but life gets busy. Bills come. You learn to find peace in simplicity." Evans nodded slowly. "Still, what you did yesterday, that wasn't just a math problem, George. That meant something to those kids, to the staff. To me," George gave a faint smile, "it was just calculus." "No," Evans said firmly. "It was a revelation." Mr. Reed's silence, meanwhile, in room 218. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Mr. Reed stood at the whiteboard, his tone noticeably subdued as he reviewed limits with the class. The sarcasm was dulled, the edge blunted. He didn't mention the day before, but his students did. In whispers passed between desks in the subtle way they glanced at him differently now. The authority he had wielded with sharpness no longer felt unshakable. After class, Wes Granger lingered by his desk. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, "the way Mr. Ellis broke down that equation yesterday, it's the same method you taught us last week, just clearer." Reed adjusted the papers on his desk, avoiding the boy's eyes. "Well, perhaps he has experience." His voice was steady but thin, as if stretched too tightly over his pride. "Did you know he went to Georgia Tech?" Wes pressed. "Apparently he was an engineer." Reed didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and he dismissed Wes with a curt nod. But the boy's words lingered in the air long after the classroom emptied. The beginning of something. By the end of the day, 3 students were waiting near the supply closet where George usually kept his tools. One of them held a thick calculus textbook. Another carried a notebook filled with half-worked equations. The third, a quiet sophomore named Jaden, looked at George with nervous determination. "Mr. Ellis," he asked, "would you mind showing us that chain rule thing again? The way you explained it." "We actually got it." George blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" They nodded eagerly. He hesitated, glancing down at his gloves still dusted with chalk from fixing a squeaky hinge earlier. Then, with a quiet sigh, he set them aside. He took the textbook, led them to a small table near the back of the library, and began explaining. Not just the steps, but the why behind each one. He asked questions. He paused to let them think. He corrected gently, encouraged freely. And for the first time in years, George felt something stir inside him. A spark he thought he had left behind in those classrooms at Georgia Tech. The incident. The quiet man in the hallways, George Ellis, had walked the same hallways of Chesterfield High for 7 years. His days began long before the first bus groaned up the cracked asphalt driveway, before sneakers squeaked against linoleum floors, before lockers slammed and laughter echoed. He arrived while the hallways still slept. When the morning light filtered weakly through dust-smeared windows and silence clung to the building like a second skin. He was a tall man with a quiet presence, a wiry frame wrapped in the dark blue janitor's uniform issued by the district. His gait was steady, purposeful, each step a rhythm he had long since memorized. The squeak of his mop bucket wheels against tile was as familiar to him as the ticking of a clock. On his belt hung a heavy ring of keys, each one worn smooth by years of use. Doors to classrooms, storage closets, the gym, even the trophy case no student had opened in decades. George was used to being invisible, not in a way that made him bitter, but in the way of someone who had learned that invisibility came with a certain freedom. He could watch without being watched, listen without being expected to speak. Teachers brushed past him in the staff lounge with polite nods, but rarely learned his last name. Students seldom looked up when he swept their crumbs or tightened the bolts on a desk wobbling dangerously close to collapse. That morning had been no different, or so he thought. Mr. Reed's calculus class by. Fourth period. The math wing was buzzing with impatience. The students of room 218 had grown used to Mr. Reed's sharp tone, his habit of pacing back and forth in front of the whiteboard like a general drilling troops. He was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, compensating with sarcasm and raised eyebrows when students failed to answer quickly enough. Today, however, he was in rare form. "You people don't listen," Mr. Reed barked, slapping a dry erase marker against the board as if it were a weapon. "You don't study and then you expect the answers to just, what? Magically appear in your heads?" A murmur of nervous laughter rippled through the class. "Let's see if anyone can solve this derivative problem without embarrassing themselves." He scrawled an equation across the board. Fex 3 pontanang, 3 more effect, arn 3 dons 2x, egg 3, 4 evang, 3 9 wax, 3 4. The derivative. "People," he said with exaggerated patience. "Product rule, chain rule. You've heard of these, yes?" No one volunteered. The silence thickened. Mr. Reed's lips curled into something resembling a smirk, then his eyes flicked toward the door. The janitor interrupted George had come in quietly, pushing his mop bucket, intending only to wipe down the scuffed tiles near the doorway before moving on. But Mr. Reed, sensing an audience, saw his chance. "Ah, Mr. Ellis," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Care to show the class how it's done? Or is calculus a little above your pay grade?" Laughter erupted, sharp and quick like the snap of rubber bands. A few students lowered their eyes, uncomfortable, but most leaned forward, eager for a show. George paused, mop handle resting lightly against his shoulder. His expression was unreadable. He had been mocked before, quietly behind his back or in half-heard whispers, but rarely so openly and never in front of 30 pairs of expectant eyes. Mr. Reed leaned on the marker like a staff. "Go on, George. Take a crack at it. Entertain us." The revelation, George set the mop aside. He stepped toward the board, the students' laughter softening into curiosity. He picked up a marker, his long fingers steady despite the hush that had fallen over the room. For a moment, he simply looked at the equation. Then, without hesitation, he began. "First," he said, his voice calm, deep, carrying an authority the students had never heard from him. We recognize this as a product of two functions. He wrote swiftly, cleanly, 32 plus x, v, kc4 u, 3c2 plus 2x, quad v or x3 4 u first 3 4. So the derivative of fx uvfx is uvfx uv is fx uv uvfx is uv plus uvfx uv. His marker moved across the board in long, sure strokes. No stumbles, no second guessing. He explained each step, his tone patient, almost gentle, as though guiding rather than instructing. You take the derivative of u cos 6 square miles 2u, 6 plus 2u times 6 plus 2. A pause. Then, and the derivative of v3 gets 2, v to 3 get 2, v to 3 get 2. The class was silent now, every eye fixed on him. So we combine 6 plus 2, x3, 4, yield 2x, 3, 2, 6 plus 2, here 3, 4. 4, 3, 2 plus x, 3, 2, 6 plus 3, 4, 3, 2 plus x, 3, 2. His marker clicked against the board as he capped it. He stepped back, hands relaxed at his sides. That, he said simply, is your derivative. The stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then slowly whispers began to ripple through the room. Wait, did he just... He didn't even look at notes. He did that in his head? Mr. Reed's face had tightened, his smirk evaporated. He cleared his throat, muttered something about lucky guesswork, and turned back to shuffle his papers. But the class wasn't watching him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on George, who had already picked up his mop again, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He rolled the bucket out of the room without another word. But the silence he left behind was louder than anything that had come before.